think my presentation is going to be not slightly, but quite different from what Johannes just presented. What I've tried to do is basically, bringing in a little bit of the broader picture, also trying to take in certain angles that I'm dealing with in my work at the European Environment Agency as a project manager in soil, but also land, broadly speaking. And in that sense, I'm trying to bring a little bit of knowledge from different disciplines together as well. There's a reason why I put this picture here up front. It's basically because whenever I mention land during my talk, I actually refer, in a physical sense, talking about land, I'm talking about the three-dimensional body, which is on the surface. You have two-dimensional land cover, land use, you could say, and the third dimension would be the soil, which also gives a certain quality dimension to land, if you want, and which is unfortunately also often forgotten. And luckily, Johannes mentioned already quite intensively about soil threats, soil functions, etc. So that makes my work a little bit easier. Just a short word on the agency. Well, the main mission is reporting on the environment in a policy relevant and timely manner. And in order to bring that content, we obviously need data, for which we need an infrastructure as well. But most importantly, we need a network of countries. And in that sense, the agency is broader than the European Union. There is a network of 33 member and 6 cooperating countries, so the cooperating countries being the Western Balkans. And this network with the countries is organized through so-called national focal points, which have a number of thematic national reference centers around them. So there's one on soils, for example, or also one on land use and spatial planning. And then you also have these ETCs, European Topic Centers, so they basically help us project managers in Copenhagen to do a lot of the technical work. In our case, it has a lot to do with geospatial analysis, for example. Well, the title of my talk refers to resource efficiency and intensification and sustainable intensification. Why talking about resource efficiency when we're talking about land? Well, first of all, land is a non-renewable resource, so I give some certain data from literature, but basically the message is that soil degradation can be much faster than soil formation, and in that sense we can consider soil a non-renewable resource. I also call it land broadly a finite resource. Well, first of all, if you look at the extent of land, for example, in comparison to seas, whatever, there's only a certain area of land. But then focusing on soils, if you see this diagram here where resources are classified in a certain way, you notice that soil is being classified under the so-called flow resources. But it also goes with the note that a critical zone resource can become a stock resource, i.e. a finite resource, once its regenerative capacity is exceeded. And there we obviously have to think about the quality of soil that is being degraded and think of the fact that that soil can be in such a state that its functions are no longer, or that it's not properly functioning anymore. Well, resource efficiency, the fact that it is relevant is also visible through the policy context, also in EU level. So earlier we had this thematic strategy on the sustainable use of natural resources. There was also the roadmap to a resource-efficient Europe, but currently the most important piece of guiding policy document, I would say, is the 7th Environmental Action Program, where it's really about living within the limits that we have on our planet. So there's also in both in the roadmap to resource efficient Europe and in the 7th EAP, there's special reference or specific reference to land and soils, for example, in relation to contaminated sites, to soil organic matter decline, to soil erosion, but also to the fact that we keep consuming land in Europe. There's an ongoing tendency of taking more land, good quality land, for example, for agriculture, and using that for development. And obviously, it's not saying that development is bad, but the issue of trade-offs is coming in here, trade-offs and synergies. And in a way, even the 70 AP does not really mention a target, a policy target, apart then from the fact that there is this mentioning of, or this vision at least, of no net land take by 2050. Also, these documents have relevance to the global level in the fact that it talks about telecoupling, so the fact that we use through importing food, use actually land in third countries. And that also brings me to a global or to a policy document that is globally relevant, which is the Rio +20 outcome document, where they are talking about a land degradation neutral world in the context of sustainable development. So these two pieces, no net land take and land degradation neutral world, are actually the only two things that have a little bit of a target, but other than that we don't really have policy targets in the area. And just to mention also that the 70 AP is also the building block for the planned Commission communication on land as a resource. So now a little bit into semantics and digging deeper into resource efficiency. I'm not an economist, well, I'm more of an apprentice economist, I would say. But I mean, in essence, it's an economic concept. And this is now a diagram taken from my lecture notes as well. But basically, in the end, it's about striking a balance between costs and benefits, and the main message there, here it's applied to environmental policies, but the main message there as well, finding that optimal level as it is pictured in that graph is basically an illusion, because the information is not there to do it. So next best could then be cost effectiveness, next best or kind of more practical way of working, where it's either about maximizing an outcome with given resources or achieving a given outcome with the minimum amount of resources. And if I'm trying to interpret this in the context of land use resource efficiency, well, then I'm in a way thinking about inputs versus outputs. So the one scenario, maximizing an outcome, I would kind of picture as what we currently have as intensification, but knowing that there's a lot of extra inputs being used to actually reach that maximum outcome, which then results in these negative environmental effects or environmental externalities. And the other scenario where we say, okay, where we recognize that there are boundaries, that there is a limit to the land that we can use in the way we use it, in a way then respecting these planetary boundaries would, on the one hand, point to a scenario where you put certain policy targets, and in some cases could maybe also point towards extensification. This dualism of intensification, extensification is actually what we currently have in Europe. We have quite a specialized land use in a way, where the two exist, and both of which can have negative effects on the environment. So the question is there an alternative, and is there a role of technology in this? And in this case, I found, just to broaden up again, and I find the concept of inclusive green economy quite useful. There we have, so in the economy circle, the blue one, we have the resource efficiency again. So it's indeed about improving resource efficiency, so making best use of the natural resources we have, but at the same time recognizing that we should reduce the environmental risks and scarcities, i.e. accepting that there are boundaries to the environment, and then at the same time aiming at human well-being, not only in a material sense or in the sense of economic growth, but also in the sense of quality of life, and even you could add an additional dimension in the sense of participation in political processes. And that brings me to a more concrete infilling of what this alternative could be. I'm quoting the definition from the Montpellier panel on sustainable intensification, where they claim that it offers a practical pathway towards the goal of producing more food with less impact on the environment. So basically doing more with less, which is basically what resource efficiency is supposed to be all about. So in other words, it's intensifying the food production while ensuring the natural resource base on which agriculture depends is sustained and indeed improved for future generations. Which in a way resonates very well with the inclusive green economy concept that I just illustrated before. And noting here as well that food production is obviously only one of the many land functions. Johannes illustrated quite a few others, for example, regulation and of the environment. I mean, in a way, land has also provides also cultural services in the sense that landscapes are used for amenity value, etc. And so in order to reach the sustainable intensification, they see three components or approaches to reach it. So you have the block of ecological intensification, where we come in a way to environment-friendly farming systems or farming practices. Like Johannes, I'm not going into technology assessment. I guess that would be focusing in on exactly what the impacts would be of applying those technologies or systems. Genetic intensification is another group or another component that they see, or another approach that they see to sustainable intensification. And also there you have a lot of technology components. But the interesting one, and the one I'm going to focus on a little bit more, is what I would see as the carrier for the other two, is the socioeconomic intensification, because this is about changes in society that will be needed in order to carry the three of them through, so to say, and in order to have sustainable intensification actually happen. And here I refer to a paper that is often used in system thinking and in transition thinking, and that has also become more, mainstream in the agency where I'm working. And I'm basically trying to apply it to land systems, or in this particular sense also to the use of land in an agricultural context. So what we basically have is three components there. If we're talking about socio-technological systems, you have on the one hand the production side, on the other hand the consumption side or the user side. So on the production side, what you have there, like knowledge, capital, natural resources, labor, or basically the production factors, right? And so the place where these two meet is what is called here the distribution. And that place is not done, well, it obviously needs, it's a place of meeting in a physical sense, because there obviously need for infrastructure to have this meeting happening. But it's also meeting in a social way, in the sense that there's also interaction of different actors in that meeting place. And these interactions are ruled by a set of rules. And if you focus more, one thing I forgot to mention here, the key thing, the central thing about socio-technical systems would be to deliver societal functions. But then if you focus more in on the rules and the rules that are carried out by the different actors, then we're talking about regimes. And in this picture, you have a number of parallel regimes that are happening at the same, that have their own trajectories. And so if these trajectories are aligned, for example, say we have the current agricultural system, how do you call it? Well, let's say the traditional, what we know nowadays, which can be quite business-oriented and is fully focused on intensification. That needs a number of regimes that go with it. It needs policies that sustain it, also within the society, amongst farmers, talking about stakeholders, it has to be sustained. So as long as these trajectories are aligned, we have a stable system, and it's very difficult to bring about change. You almost need to disrupt these trajectories in order to bring about some kind of change. And this is what is depicted in this diagram here, where theory goes that you can have a technological niche, for example. Conservation agriculture is now a big thing, but let's take that one now. So it's a different farming system, but let's say that in a certain environment it's sustained. But then as long as for example, the supply side from the SOCO project, the one that Thomas referred to, was also clear that people who wanted to turn into conservation agriculture, they faced, for example, problems like just the current suppliers of machinery wouldn't have the machinery that they would need, so they would have to adapt the machinery themselves to the conditions and to really apply conservation agriculture. So there, you really need the supply side that has to change as well. From the point of view of policy, you also need some policy incentive that would support that kind of change. So you really need the disruption of the existing system in order to move into a new kind of regime. And then sometimes external pressures, what is indicated here, like landscape developments, can help in this. For example, these would be elements that would be that would not be in the control of the actors in place. So, for example, climate change is something that is outside of an actor's reach, or it could, in this case, could also be like changes in consumption patterns, which would create a different demand and which also puts a certain pressure. So you really need a number of changes in regimes so that they are no longer aligned in order to create a breakthrough and to have a real change in technology to take place. Now, bringing this back to land systems. This would be the basic DPSIR driving force pressure state impact response framework that we often use for our environmental impact assessments. And looking at the previous figure, you already see that a certain dimension is missing, because if we think about drivers, you actually need, it's not only about the one external force, but you have to think about what regimes have to be broken, and that there has to be some kind of a niche behind that is protected enough to make it and to create a breakthrough eventually. But the most important message I wanted to take out of this is that I started off with saying resource efficiency is in the beginning, or is essentially an economic or originally an economic concept, but already in policy you see it being used as an governance concept, and it's also the way in which it is used here. So implying that it's much more than just thinking about cost and benefits, but it's really bringing in the different sustainability dimensions, and this is actually also what you have illustrated with your impact assessments. That's basically what I wanted to do with this presentation, but I would like to make a little advert. It's 2015. Every 5 years the agency does a State of the Environment reporting, and the next one is due very soon, next week. So if you're interested, there's a thematic, you can check on the website. There's a thematic briefing on soil and land systems as well. And with this, I want to thank you for your attention. And in case I don't know whether the presentations are going to be shared, but yeah, anyway, so there you have the information. Thank you.
question on that second last slide with the scale. There was a scale underneath if I were
this one. Oh, yeah.
Supply demand. So, do you think there is a supply demand involved in these?
Well, it's how to say. It's a simplified way of presenting things, obviously, but in a way, yeah, that's how I interpret it. Yeah, well, maybe not in your in a traditional economic way of thinking, but there as well, I would see that governance and governance may be also meaning here in quite a broad way of anything that involves a decision that brings about change. I put it deliberately in the middle because it's what can make the shift between the two.
You refer to fields and you show the niche and regime. And can you also think that it is happening now that some processing are moving to regimes or to landscape and new practices
in agriculture or generally? I mean, the full breakthrough, I would be a little bit skeptical about, because in that sense, I think we're still. I mean, there's things, smaller things happening, and that's it's more this incubator type of thing. Like this would be the niches, I think, then in this case, but that has been really transferred across the different levels. I wouldn't say so, no. Well, that's at least if from the environmental impact side of things, that's not the signal yet that we get. So from that point of view, but yeah, I mean, when do we have a full-blown transition? That's maybe another question. But I mean, yeah, there's a lot of indications that we still have the existing structures in place pretty much. I mean, along with the lobbying that goes on in Brussels by big businesses, etc. So, I mean, there's obviously signals of change, but I think it may need a couple of more reiterations.
What do you think has to happen to bring more sustainability to the regime level? Would be the next step.
And your question is, what do I think that needs to happen?
Referring to this multi-level perspective, always the aim is to bring a new system to the regime level.
Yeah.
How could this be possible, referring to the soil use, to the sustainable soil?
Yeah. I mean, that's just my personal view on things, obviously. I mean, in agri-food industry, there's still big. I mean, the big industries that dominate a lot of the, not only of the business but also of the policy. I mean, either it can be directly through lobbying, but I mean, if you look at the CAP and how the new CAP and how it has been watered down, I mean, there's still a lot of forces, call it business or political. I mean, there's still a lot of forces that go against it. What needs to happen? I don't know. Maybe it's naive to think that the demand side, i.e., the consumer, could bring about a bigger change there. But I think definitely in our consumer decisions, that's I mean, through our own decisions, we can bring about small changes. Whether that's going to cause the big leap, I mean, that requires a society to point their noses eventually in a different direction.
Can you discuss a bit? Or?
Okay.
Because I was just thinking, in another project we were discussing about climate change, how this will affect agriculture, and if it's possible already to develop now narratives, they call it. How will it be when climate change really hits? And I thought, maybe we can just look back to what happened in the United States when the Dust Bowl events happened. So a certain area of the States got really turned into a desert within only maybe 10, 15, 20 years, where it was like the opposite of a slow motion. It was a fast-forward scenario maybe of climate change in a nutshell. So, and now to your question, I thought, I think big changes always happen when the pressure is
big enough.
Sometimes maybe the world or human mankind is always very slow, and that makes me think of the keynote presentation this morning. The pressure has to maybe even rise more until the last one accepts that there has to be something to be changed. It would be maybe easier to change things now, even less costly, but the big change will only happen when everybody feels it, when the sea level rises and so on. So maybe also for agriculture, there needs to be more pressure that the last policymaker also found out, and the last farmer, and so on, that everybody feels like, okay, we accept we have to change, even though it's costly.
And there, yeah, it makes me also, I mean, I definitely agree with you, but it makes me also think about the whole land and soil policy dossier field, whatever you want to call it. I mean, on the one hand, if you look at climate change, for example, it was the evidence eventually, the evidence base that climate change is happening that made climate change, that brought it onto the political agenda globally. With land and soil, I mean, on the one hand, there's no policy there at the EU. I mean, there are policies at national level, but there's definitely no agreement that there has to happen something internationally. So that makes then that there's no need. Usually, if there is a regulation or a directive, there's some requirements for monitoring. So on the one hand, the lack of the policy makes that the monitoring is not happening, and on the other hand, the monitoring at the same time makes that we cannot build really up this evidence base where we can really track changes over time and make the case that soils are degrading or land is degrading generally. So that's another thing in this whole field of land and soils as well, that you're really dealing with kind of a chicken and egg situation.